Okay, we have started a new Torah portion, and not just a new Torah portion, we've started a new book of the Torah, which last week when we finished up, when we finish a book of the Torah, we usually say chazak, chazak, v'ni chazek, which means be strong, may we be strengthened. And this is what we would expect studying the word to do, is to strengthen us. And to make us stronger for the hard times ahead, because hard times are coming. If you're not experiencing hard times, then cheer up, it's going to get worse. That we can predict with certainty, that times will get worse before they get better. But I can also predict with certainty that those who are walking with Yeshua, walking in his testimonies, walking in his commandments, it's not going to be as tough. He's actually given us some comfort, I think, in this Torah portion, and I'm kind of moving back in terms of material. Typically, we deal with the material in Shemot, which means names, by the way, with more of the material on the front end of the Torah portion, because it's very interesting. It's deeply symbolic, especially like with Moshe and the little ark and the reeds and the Nile and the numbers that keep coming up within that Torah portion, especially in the threes and so forth. And Sister Miriam, there's so many things in this Torah portion we could focus on. But this year, I wanted to focus on sometimes it's hard to see breaks in a Torah portion. I don't know if you've noticed that. Sometimes it feels like maybe we missed a sentence, but we didn't really. And there's kind of an ellipsis when we look at this Torah portion where it feels like, okay, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh. They made these demands of Pharaoh. And then Pharaoh basically doubles down, which seems to be the practice nowadays. When somebody confronts you with what you're doing wrong, then you just double down and do more of it. I'm not really sure where that sort of response came about, but we can see where its origins are, and obviously it's in Egypt, right? But I want to look at this place where it seems like Moses just kind of disappears off the scene for a moment. He and Aharon have had this audience with Paro. They say, let my people go, basically, and the king of Egypt doubles down and says, oh no, I'm going to make it harder. You guys have just got way too much free time. And so we're going to fix that, and you'll stop this whining around and talking about extra vacation days, right? And you'll quit talking about needing to have off on Shabbat because, that's your day of rest and all that. That should sound very modern. That should sound very contemporary to your ears, because you've probably all dealt with it. And if you haven't yet, you probably will in some way. Friends, family, bosses, and so forth. So we've got a test of the wills here. We've got a choice. And we'll say it's a limited choice at this point when we looked at all the information in the portion. We have a choice. We can either obey the Holy One of Israel, and we can keep his Shabbat, we can keep his feasts, or we can obey Pharaoh, who says, get back to your labors. He said, no, wait a minute, it's not that easy. There's all sorts of obstacles between me and just deciding I'm going to obey the word when it comes to Shabbat and the feasts. Especially if I have a job, especially if I work for someone else, especially if I have a family. And you're right. And we're going to look at some interesting contexts when it comes to this Torah portion to see if we can work out where we are today as it pertains to this Torah portion. And our condition today is not going to be identical to someone living in Israel, by the way. Because in Israel, all the obstacles that seems like are put in place on purpose to prevent us from keeping Shabbat and the feasts. When you go to Israel, unless you go to you choose to go to a secular neighborhood, or a town, like say a kibbutz, that's going to run on a secular schedule, you're typically going to have to work at breaking the Shabbat. Things are kind of reversed. It's just like at Pesach when you go shopping. Well, either the chametz is going to be gone out of the stores, or if there's any question about it, it's going to be roped off, or you can't access those aisles or buy anything off of those aisles. But when we live in Egypt, when we live in exile, everything's kind of reversed. It's just the opposite. It's as though everything you're not supposed to do is constantly pushed at you. You're hammered with it. And everything you should do, they try to rope it away from you and make it inaccessible. And so I think this Torah portion is going to give you some courage when it comes to that. When you feel like my circumstances are less than ideal, I feel like sometimes I fall down on the job here. Like Paul said, the things I want to do, I don't always do. And it's not because you want to disobey. And that's going to be the key of the portion. At least when we look at these cross references in other parts of the Torah to the situation the Israelites are going to encounter in this Torah portion. But before we jump in, I want to review a slide from last week's Torah portion, Vayechi, because we're pulling forward this concept of the firstborn, the Bechor, the Bichorim, the first fruits of your grain and so forth. Let me just pull it up and share it. Quit talking and just let you look at it. And this is the thing we need to pull forward from all those words that we studied last week that had this same three-letter Hebrew root. In fact, we actually looked at how many ways you could scramble it and still come up with the same idea. And we still come up with the same gematria, which is 222. And then we saw that the relationship between father and son is often symbolized by some multiple of 2, whether it's 2, 20, or 222. We saw that. But here's what I wanted to review from last week, and then we'll go to this week. It says it's important to understand about the role of the Bechor, or the firstborn. The Bechor was the one who would most closely resemble his father's will and spiritual obligations. He would lead, he would intercede, and this is why he needed the extra portion. This is why he needed the blessing, in order to carry out those obligations of preserving the family. And of course, we know that Yeshua is a first fruit from the dead because he was the extension of his father. He kept saying, I am the Father in one. If you look at me, you've seen the Father. As a Bechor, he is the extension of his father's will. And when we look at Israel as also being called a firstborn or an assembly of the firstborn, then that tells you if you were called by the name Israel, then your behavior, your attributes should be those that most closely represent the Father's. You're an extension of the Father. And so if people want to understand the Father, they look at you as that extension, that you're the one most likely to act according to the Father's will and spiritual obligations. Okay, so we're going to take that down and go to this one. There we go. All right, so we have Shemot. Here's your scripture references. And I want to talk tonight about the straw man. In fact, I want to talk tonight and tomorrow about the straw man, just to play with the expression. And I'm not sure where we even came up with this expression. I remember I had to take basically hermeneutics classes in both undergraduate and graduate school. And the purpose of that was to teach you how to read a text critically. In other words, to recognize a logical fallacy when an author or a scholar is trying to advance an argument and the argument is fallacious in some way. then we had to learn to identify those things, because if you simply incorporate a fallacious argument into your thesis or into your dissertation, then you get laughed out of the room, basically, and you get a nice pat on the back, and they say, thank you for the tuition check. Unfortunately, our news outlets, our media outlets, don't seem to be bound by the same rules of ethics when it comes to their research. And they consistently, I wouldn't say on the hour, I would say by the second, if you are watching a news feed, then you are watching a continuous reel of fallacies, logical fallacies. One of those fallacies is called the straw man. And so here's the definition, because the point of this is I want to point out the straw man in Pharaoh's argument. It says a straw man fallacy occurs when someone takes another person's argument or point, distorts it or exaggerates it in some kind of extreme way, and then attacks the extreme distortion as if that is really the claim the first person is making. And there's all sorts of ways to do this, by the way. And so here's an example. I don't live in a place where we have bicycle lanes, but I can go to Lexington about an hour from here, and they do have bicycle lanes, and they have all sorts of things to make it bicycle friendly. And you see a lot of people riding to work on bicycles or going to school on bicycles. But here would be an example of an argument. Somebody would advance the idea that bicycle infrastructure should be expanded because cycling is a sustainable mode of transportation. All right, let's say you don't like that idea. It's annoying to you when those bicycles roll between the lanes, and sometimes they go when it's a red light, or sometimes they don't stop at the stop sign. You've noticed somebody breaking the rule. And so your straw man argument would be, we should not build bike lanes because cyclists run red lights and they endanger pedestrians. Now you can see how that's a distortion. Not every single cyclist runs red lights. Not every single cyclist tries to run over pedestrians, unless you've ever been to Oxford in England, and then I think they do try. They just ring the bell to let you know you're about to get hammered. But for the most part, in a normal place, bicyclists don't intentionally hit pedestrians because we fall down too when we hit things. So that's what the straw man argument is going to do. It's going to completely ignore the positive aspects of, say, building bicycle lanes or places to park and secure your bicycle in public areas and so forth. One thing I really like is like Lextran, the public bus system in Lexington. They also have buses where you can stow your bicycle. So if, say, you rode to work and it was sunny, but then, the storm of the century moves in while you're at work, you can hop on the bus and still have a place to stow your bicycle and get home. So again, we could look at a few examples of poor cycling and say we shouldn't do all these things, but what we're completely ignoring is that, yes, some positive things could come out of it. And then number two, I can't paint every cyclist as a lawbreaker and somebody that endangers pedestrians. And so people will say, no, that's not the point. This is the point. And that's what they'll do. They'll shift the point, either through exaggeration, distortion, deleting facts, ignoring facts. That's the way that works. And there's all sorts of ways to do it. Okay, so let's look at the straw man in our Torah portion. And this is from Shemot 5, 6 through 8. It says in chapter 5, verse 1, Moses and Aharon came and said to Pharaoh, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go, that they may celebrate a feast to me in the wilderness." Okay, this is the argument that Moses and Aharon are advancing to Pharaoh for consideration. let my people go, and here's the reason why. They should be celebrating a chag, a feast to me. And so what Paro does is he activates the strong man. Notice how he shifts the point, because when he replies, he says, he commanded the taskmasters over the people and their foremen. So actually, he's turning the Hebrews against the Hebrews because they had Hebrew taskmasters as well. If you worked in a prison, you might call them trustees, right? Which would be inmates in charge of other inmates, which they don't do in the feds, but I think they still do in some of the states. But basically, you take some from that group to be foreman over the group. And he says, you are no longer to give the people straw to make brick as previously. Let them go and gather straw for themselves. But the quota of bricks, which they were making previously, you shall impose on them. You are not to reduce any of it. Because they are lazy, therefore they cry out, let us go and sacrifice to our God. So he's saying, the argument you're advancing, Moses, is invalid. What's actually going on here is that the people are lazy. They've got too much free time to sit around and think about causing me problems. And so I'm going to fix the real problem here. I'm going to fix their laziness. I'm going to make their work harder. And he says he's dismissive of the actual argument that's being advanced, the actual proposal before him. The proposal before him is basically an act of worship to the Holy One of Israel, which he says he doesn't know. He says, I don't know this person. I don't know this God. I'm not familiar with it. And so he turns the important information, completely ignores what it actually is. It's a challenge of deities, because we know that the Egyptians had over 2,000 deities that they worshiped, and which it's kind of understandable maybe that Pharaoh wouldn't know the Hebrews' God out of the 2,000 plus that they worshiped. Maybe he didn't stand out, but he shifts the argument. He says, it's just because you're lazy. And what does he do? He pushes the real premise aside, which is for a Hebrew, for an Israelite, we have specific requirements in order to serve our God, Pharaoh. And part of these requirements is we have specified feasts to celebrate. We have a specified Shabbat, a Sabbath, that we should be observing. And so what we're actually asking for is the freedom to celebrate those feasts. See, they're not actually even asking to be freed from slavery with this particular argument. It's freedom to celebrate the feast. And instead of recognizing this or even acknowledging this, he shifts it and says, you're just a bunch of lazy people. And therefore, he doesn't really have to acknowledge that this is about to become a war of the heavens against his gods. The Hebrews, the one they serve, it's going to be a direct confrontation between the two. So here's a couple of things. Yes, we can agree, and you see how Pharaoh recognizes this. He actually takes part of their argument and acknowledges it. At the very same time he's dismissing it, he picks up what the argument is, because the strong man's not going to work otherwise. He's, let us go and sacrifice to our God. He says, yes, this is what they're saying, but it's because they're lazy. He's saying it's not because they really want to obey their God. It's just because they're lazy. It's not really a legitimate request, because they're just being lazy. And, like I said, it's very contemporaneous, because how many of us have ever requested some days off for a Shabbat, for a high Sabbath, to celebrate a feast, and people were dismissive. They were in disbelief of our true motive. And they thought we were trying to disrupt the work schedule in some way. They didn't think we were sincere because, hey, you didn't ask to do this last year. See, that's the difficulty when people have a transformation in their walk of faith. Maybe they didn't do this last year, but they're asking this year because there's been a transformation. So it's not because they're being fake or they're trying to capitalize on something and get more days off, more vacation days, but it's because their life has been transformed in some ways. But it's hard for people to recognize that as anything more than being disruptive. So he's purposely setting the real point aside. Moses is basically saying, no, Pharaoh, you are not a demigod. And none of these other 2,000 things that you're worshiping, these are not God either. But Pharaoh, his defense mechanism here is to change it from a religious issue to one of work ethics, basically bread and butter. Right? And that's typically what people will do when they're not accustomed to these sorts of requests for a Shabbat or a feast day off. They won't really see it as a religious issue. They will see it as you making trouble and that you don't have a really good work ethic and you're not, really looking out for the good of the company and so forth, or that you're trying to undercut the supervisor. You're making your coworkers work harder. We've heard all of those things. Why? Because the straw man has been activated. They don't really want to look at the issue of faith. So again, we reviewed this in that first slide, but this is moving into a new book, Exodus 4, 22 through 23. It says, then you shall say to Paro, thus says the Lord, Israel is my son, my firstborn. So I said to you, let my son go, that he may serve me. But you have refused to let him go. Behold, I will kill your son, your firstborn. So we can see, from last week when we looked at Elisha crying out, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. And then as Elisha himself is about to cross over, Jehoash says, my father, the king of the chariots of Israel and its horsemen, where that repetition of father, my father. Well, now what we have is basically a turnabout where Adonai is saying, Israel is my son, my firstborn. He's my son, my son, my son. And if you refuse to let my firstborn go, the one who is an extension of me, see, if you keep the Israelites hostage, it's as if you're keeping me hostage, because my firstborn has a job to do. He's an extension of me. He has my business to do in the earth. And Pharaoh doesn't even realize how important it is that Israel be freed to perform the functions of the firstborn on behalf of the world, because without the Shabbat, I don't believe the world would stand. If there was ever a point where there wasn't a human being left to keep it, I think basically you've ruined the very goodness of creation, and something not so very good is going to follow after that. But there's always been a remnant of people who have kept the Shabbat. And he says, you don't let my firstborn go as an extension of me, then I'm going to kill the extension of you, your firstborn. Because Israel is the nation most like the Father. And they must serve the Father by serving his family. And that's, remember, it's mentioned in the Gospels, when Joseph takes Miriam and Yeshua to Egypt to escape Herod, that verse is quoted, out of Egypt I have called my son. Which son? My firstborn, the one that is most like an extension of the Father. He has to serve the father by serving the family. And so when we look at Egypt's firstborn, and I think this is why we have the first basically miracle, sign and wonder, is going to be the rod, the serpent, the rod turning into the serpent, is to demonstrate the difference that Egypt is the son, most like the serpent. Egypt is the firstborn son that is most like an extension of the serpent and a beast of the field, because the serpent represents the beasts of the field, basically the wild beasts. This is what they represent. Now, I want to remind you of something we studied in the last cycle, and it has to do with those supernatural bugs. We look at them in quite a bit of detail in Revelation, way more than we do in the Torah. In fact, when you're reading through it in the Torah, it just kind of moves right on through it. It might translate it out as a locust. It might call it a hornet. But then when we get into John's Revelation, we realize he's having a difficulty even describing what it is, because he might say it's a hornet. He might say it's a locust. He might say it's a scorpion. He might say it's a serpent. He might say it's a horse. You can see he's having difficulty because there is no earthly creature that exactly will match what this tzira is. And remember, it was in Exodus 23:28. In that case, probably an NASB translated as hornet, but it's a tzira. And you can hear tsar in the tzira. Tsar meaning tribulation, a narrow place, a place where you're squeezed. You can hear tsar in Mitzrayim, which is Egypt, which means from the tribulations. And so this is what the Tosefta says about the tzira, this supernatural bug that comes out of Abaddon. Abaddon being synonymous with Sheol, except Abaddon tends to be like describing things coming out of there as like the lowest part of it, a bottomless sort of thing, a pit. But here's what the rabbis say about it. The hornet, the tzira, did not cross the Yarden with them. The Gemara asks, and did it not? But isn't it written, and I will send the hornet before you, which shall drive out the Hivites and the Canaanites. Rabbi Shimon ben Lachish says, the hornet, the tzira, stood on the banks of the Yarden and threw its venom at the inhabitants of the land, and it blinded their eyes from above and castrated them from below, as it is stated in Amos 2:9. Yet I destroyed the Amorites before them, whose height was like the height of cedars, and they were strong as the oaks. Yet I destroyed their fruit from above and their roots from beneath. And that's what I wanted to remind you about from last year when we talk about the tzira, that it would attack you in two ways. The first thing it would do when it threw its venom at you, it says blinded their eyes. And in the other sources that we read, it says it confused people. Like the Sodomites who couldn't find the door to Lot's house. It was a supernatural blindness. It wasn't a natural blindness. It was a supernatural blindness. Just like this bug is not a natural bug. It's a supernatural bug. And therefore it has supernatural effects. So the first thing it does, it confuses your eyes. It makes it hard for you to understand things. And it's like, okay, that bug's already working. We see that everywhere we go. And then its second act, it says it castrates from them from below. Basically, it cuts off the reproductive process is what it does. In other words, you can't bear fruit. You cannot bear children. And this is pretty much the promise that's being made to Pharaoh. I want to confuse you so that you're going to do exactly the wrong thing every step of the way. If you keep hardening your heart, Pharaoh, there will come a point where I will harden your heart. And you're not even going to be able to see the obvious. Remember when they finally get to the end and Pharaoh's advisors say, don't you realize Egypt is lost? And that word there is avad, from Abaddon. Don't you know we're lost? Don't you know we're in the pit? Don't you know that Egypt is Abaddon? Do you not get this? But that's exactly what it does. You can be in Abaddon. You can be in the clutches of the destroyer, and your eyes are blinded, therefore they are confused. First it confuses you, and then it cuts off your offspring. And this is the second promise made to Pharaoh, basically, is I will kill your firstborn. This is the way that tzira works, and it uses trees as an example. The Amorites, the height of cedars as strong as oaks. Okay, no matter how high they were, they couldn't get away from the venom of this bug from Abaddon, the tzira. And it would still confuse them, no matter how high they were. And no matter how strong and how deep the roots of the oak, he could still destroy the oak. And that's what it means, destroyed their roots from beneath. So basically it cuts off the memory. You know, that's a huge thing in scripture is your memory, your name to live after you. And by cutting off the roots from beneath, by cutting off the fruit, the idea is there would be no descendants to carry on your name. So we've got the tzira that's about to be activated against Egypt. It's going to confuse them. Then it's going to blot out their names by killing their firstborn. And they're being compared to trees in Amos, because trees are representative of human beings in scripture. And again, as we get into the book of Revelation, we see that, you know, a third of the trees are going to be burned up. What does that mean? Trees are people. People are trees. That's the symbolism. And so he uses as many symbols as he possibly can in the book of Revelation, by the way, to get our attention and point us back to the Torah and the prophets. And that's what this is going to be, a time when the firstborn of the serpent will become confused. And remember, that's going to be one of the things that the children of the serpent do in Revelation, is they're going to worship the image of the beast. And then he's going to cut off production. He says, kill your firstborn. But see, there's a contrast in the book of Revelation. The children of the virtuous woman, Israel, how we know who her children are, her seed, is that they keep the commandments of God and the testimony of Yeshua. But how do we know the children of the great whore, of Babylon, of Jezebel? Because several different names will be used. Well, they're going to be thrown on a bed of sickness. And he says, what? I will kill her children. I will cut off her seed. So it's the same pictures being offered to us, whether we're looking at this particular Exodus or whether we're looking at a greater Exodus. And so I say, sure, if it gets worse. And I think we're already in, I don't know in terms of time, you know, has a time clock started? I don't know that. But I do know the signs. And the signs are that increasing numbers of people have entered into a spiritual confusion. They don't know good from evil. And they are basically hell-bent on cutting off fruit, on cutting off offspring. It's as though there's an agenda basically to destroy humankind and let it revert back to the wild beasts. Odd, but not unexpected. So this is the point in the text where we say, well, Moses just kind of goes missing after this incident. We've got some plagues that are going to have to start activating in order for this tzira to start doing its work of not just confusion and cutting off offspring, but it works in a number of other ways, like tzarat. You can hear the root of tsar, for tribulation, tzira, the supernatural bug, Mitzrayim, Egypt, Tzarat is actually going to be one of the plagues of Revelation too. And we went over that, how that pale horse represents the color of leprosy and how each of those horses' colors is giving you a message from the book of Vayikra about why you need to know about symptoms of Tzarat or marks of leprosy so that you can identify them, remove them from yourself, do the teshuvah, whatever you need to do to get rid of it, so that you won't be struck with confusion and your name be cut off. But at this point, the 10 plagues really haven't set in. And the Midrash comments on that. It says, this is the point at which Moses returned his wife and his children to Midian, inexplicably disappearing after he calls Israel to a feast. And you say, well, this is kind of odd. He says, well, you're supposed to be celebrating a feast, but then he disappears. And the Midrash uses a period of 6 months that it took him to take his wife and his children back to his father-in-law in Midian, and then to return back to Egypt to pick up where he left off with Pharaoh. But in the 6 months, they say, the Hebrews had all this extra work of finding straw. And then the rabbis say, this is a picture of final redemption, that a call will go out, a Redeemer will come, he will send out a call to Israel, and he will call Israel to a feast. And this is basically when the enemy will double down and do everything within his power to prevent Israel from worshiping Adonai at his appointed time. And it will seem as though the Redeemer has disappeared. In other words, you'll hear the call, yes, I agree, that's the thing I should be doing. And then all of a sudden, it's, well, where did he go? Where is he? If I'm supposed to be doing this thing, then where is he? You know, he's supposed to be leading me in this. And everybody else around me is just as overworked and confused and everything as I am. But if you think about it, there's more or less going to be 6 months between seasons of Chagim. Whether you're talking about between Pesach and Sukkot, or whether you're talking about between Sukkot and starting over at Pesach in the spring, there's typically going to be around a 6-month period. I don't know if this is where they're getting the 6-month period. But basically, Moses makes the call, come into the wilderness for 3 days, celebrate a Chag, and then he disappears. Well, how are we supposed to celebrate a Chag if Moses is gone? But is Moses really gone? If it's God's word, it doesn't depend upon a human being. It depends on the people who hear that word. But this Midrash, and the reason I brought this Midrash up is because we have something very much like it. And it's going to parallel Yeshua's conversation with some pseudo-religious Pharisees. And here's what he says in Matthew 23:23. He says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. But those are the things you should have done without neglecting the others. Now, what does this have to do with anything? Well, I'm going to show you here in a sec. But it has to do with the straw. The Hebrews have just been sent out because Pharaoh said they were lazy. He said, now you've got to find your own straw. Now, in this same context, they put this rebuke of Esau in the Midrash. And here it is. And what they're commenting on, by the way, is straw. That's the connection. I wasn't clear. What's the connection to our story? Finding your own straw. And so they compare this to Esau in Bereshit Rabbah 63:10. Rabbi Abahu said he was a trapper and a fieldsman. Esau, that is. He was trapping, which means deceiving at home, and trapping in the field, deceiving in the field. He trapped at home by asking, how do you tithe salt? And in the field, he asked, how do you tithe straw? Okay, so you say, well, that's just Jewish, literature. But what would you expect Yeshua to use? An example that the Jews of the first century were familiar with? Or would he just create one out of thin air that they had no context for? I think once we understand what's meant by this midrash, we'll agree that Yeshua is using the same premise, calling to mind Esau as it relates to this Torah portion. Because when we look at the written Torah, it emphasizes a tithe of threshed grain from which you would make bread. It does not emphasize the tithing of the straw that's left in the field for the beasts. Okay, it's a light and heavy argument. And so they're saying the characteristic of Esau, who remember was born red and hairy all over like a beast, so he relates to the red serpent, the beast of the field. His attribute is to stress the insignificant over the significant, which is exactly what Yeshua says the pseudo-religious do. He says, you should have been worried, what? About justice, mercy, and faithfulness. These are the weightier provisions of the Torah. These things are written down. But you've started laboring over ancillary tithes, not the tithe of your grain, which is critical for the feasts. But see, you only tithe, by the way, off of threshed grain that's already had the chaff removed. Once you have a finished product, that's when you calculate the tithe, by the way. That's the heavier matter. That's where you have to be faithful in your tithing, because that's going to bring justice and mercy to the family of Messiah, justice and mercy to the family of Israel, because of who shares in this grain tithe. But he said, all of a sudden now you're sweating mint, dill, and cumin, which is not written. It's simply ancillary. He says, and yeah, if you want to do that, you should have done it. But you should have done it without neglecting the weightier matter, that you have been commanded to tithe the grain, the threshed product, the important product, the substance of your sacrifices, which represent justice, mercy, and faithfulness. And instead you're sweating herbs. This is Esau, because he sweats the small stuff, the things that aren't commanded in the Torah. He sweats ancillary things. How do you tithe straw? It's not important how you tithe straw. It's important how you tithe the grain from the straw. And so when we're talking about pseudo-religious people, this is their straw man. They will seize sometimes upon something of insignificance and make it seem as though that is the important thing, completely distracting and confusing from that which is weightier. Justice, mercy, faithfulness. Well, how can Israel be faithful to their God if they cannot keep his Shabbat and his feasts? If they're out chasing around trying to find the most insignificant part of the crop, which is the straw, which incidentally feeds the beast. So here's what Rabbi Kahn said about this midrash. He says, this misdirection is to deceive others, and concludes, Esau chose to split hairs, to befuddle the minds of others by mocking the letter of the law, while ignoring the spirit of the law. He focused on insignificant aspects of the law in order to obscure or to justify his refusal to submit to a higher order of moral accountability. And I think that's exactly what Yeshua was saying to these hypocrites. You're deceiving others. You're confusing their minds. You're making light of the letter of the Torah. You're completely ignoring the spirit of the Torah. You're focusing on insignificant things to obscure the real issue. And the real issue is the fact is that a hypocrite will refuse to submit to a higher order of moral accountability. That's why he will misdirect into the straw. He will misdirect into the menthe, the dill, and the cumin. And so you can see how Esav, or those like Esav, those who are extensions of the beast of the field, the most like their father, the serpent, you can see how the tzira would be connected not only to their methods, which is to confuse and then to cut off fruit from those who would be faithful, because see, only mercy, justice, and faithfulness is going to bring forth fruit. But by obscuring and confusing the issue, he can cut off the fruit. And that's why you see this turnabout in the book of Revelation. When the tzira comes out of Abaddon, out of Egypt, he's going to take those same methods and he's going to torment the Egyptians, the unrepentant. In the book of Revelation, it says for 5 months. And so if you're a person who habitually has used a straw man argument to confuse, to divert attention from the firstborn of the Torah, which would be mercy, justice, and faithfulness, that would be the extension of the Father and his word. Not how you tithe salt, not how you tithe straw, not how you tithe mint, dill, and cumin, but how you apply his written Torot so that it will produce fruit, so that there will be mercy, justice, and faithfulness. So if this person has used those sorts of arguments to blind other people with insignificant things, just so they'll make more bricks for that doomed empire, just so they can cut off their fruit, and that fruit would be the fruit of the Spirit. See, that's the thing about Torah. You can't just keep the rules. You can't ignore the spirit of the Torah, because it's the spirit of the Torah that's truly going to take the letter of the Torah and generate fruit in your life. So this person who has used these techniques, like Pharaoh, those techniques are going to be turned upon him, and then the tzira will come back and impose those upon the deceiver. And that's where the Midrash of Esav and Yeshua are exposing very similar motivations. Because ultimately, it's a straw confusion. It's shielding so that you won't notice that they're refusing to submit to the one, the only true living God of Israel. The only Yod He Vav He there has ever been or ever will be. And see, what Esau did was just the opposite of his father. He was the exact opposite of an extension of Isaac. Isaac was a man who always wanted spiritual clarity, even when he failed. How do we know that? Because he tried to repair the failures. And of course, our greatest example of that clarity that Yitzchak had was in submitting himself as an Olah offering, submitting himself to be that firstborn extension of Abraham. Because twice the text will tell us of that relationship between them. One is in Genesis 22:6, the other is in Genesis 22:8. In the one, it says, Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Yitzchak, his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife. And he said, This is the wood of the burnt offering. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. And he said, This is the wood of the burnt offering. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. And he said, This is the wood of the burnt offering. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. And he said, This is the wood of the burnt offering. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. And he said, This is the wood of the burnt offering. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. And he said, This is the wood of the burnt offering. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. And he said, This is the wood of the burnt offering. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. And he said, This is the wood of the burnt offering. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. And he said, This is the wood of the burnt offering. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. And he said, This is the wood of the burnt offering. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. And he said, So the two of them walked on together. And there we see the repetition from last week, where the two represents the relationship between father and son, like the stone, the Evan. Av, father, ben, son, joined in the bait, which is two. Joined in the temple, joined in the house. So there's our father and son. And then in 8, it says, Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. See the repetition of his son, my son? And again it says, so the two of them walked on together. So we see right there at the Akedah that Yitzchak is the extension of Abraham. He is the Bechor, the firstborn. And he's reflecting a couple of things. Number one, because we have the repetition, the two of them walked on together. The first time, it's to explain the fire and the knife. Yitzchak, because he did have such clarity, especially at this moment in his life, he believed in a personal sacrifice, because the fire and the knife tell you that there will be a sacrifice, that there will be an altar, and there will be a death. So when you agree to walk with your father, it is because you believe in a personal sacrifice. You don't walk it with him because you think everything's going to be just wonderful and hunky-dory and, sprinkles and rainbows. That's not why you walk with him. You walk with him because you know there's going to be fire, and you know there's going to be a knife, and you believe it's worth doing anyway. And when you agree, that you walk on together. Because in the second example, it says, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. So whatever Yitzchak was about to go through, however painful, however terrifying, the second belief was that there would be a provision, that there would be salvation of El Shaddai. Even the text says in Hebrews to resurrect, if that was necessary. And that's the walk that we need to have with the Father if the two of us are going to walk on together. One, a belief that we will walk through the fire and we will die a personal death. In fact, we'll die day after day after day in order to sacrifice this soul, appetite, emotion, desire, and intellect, and surrender it to the work of the Holy Spirit. But number two belief is, even if we feel like we're dying, that it's in view of a resurrection, that it's going to be worth it because of the resurrection, and that we don't have to provide our own salvation. He is going to provide that salvation. That belief in the resurrection is what makes you walk on together in spite of the straw, in spite of the fire, in spite of the sword and the knife. In spite of it all, you walk. And you walk because the life is in the seed. That's the important thing. Isaac believed in a resurrection. Abraham believed in a resurrection. They believed that the life was in the seed. It was in the promised seed. They knew that life was not in the straw. It's not in the chaff. It's not in the things that are separated out. It's only the seed that will live again. As an honest representation of the seed that went before. A reproduction of the seed that went before, an extension of the seed that went before. The straw and the chaff are just going to become fodder for the beasts of the field, or they'll become one with the earth again and fertilize the earth. But it is the seed that lives. And this is what the enemy wants to do, to distract us, chasing the straw, chasing the chaff, chasing the menthodil and the cumin, asking stupid questions like, how do you tithe straw? And how many stupid questions have we chased in our lives as though they were important when, you know what, the life was in the seed. Only the seed is going to live again. I need to learn to separate straw from seed. because that's what's going to sustain me, a belief in the seed. When I have to sacrifice and walk through fire and be subject to the knife, to the sword, then I need to do it because I believe that the seed has lived again in the person of Yeshua, and that therefore I will live again. Excuse me. So let's go to the first mention of straw. And this is going to be from Genesis 24:15. And first mention is important because it gives you the guideline. It gives you something to look for every time you read about straw after that. So we're going back to the story of Isaac's wife, Rivka. It says, Rivka, who was born to Betuel, the son of Milcah, the wife of Abraham's brother Nahor, came out with her jar on her shoulder. The girl was very beautiful, and no man had had relations with her. And she went down to the spring and filled her jar and came up. Okay, here's another symbol of life. It's a living spring. It's not just, stagnant water. It's living water. Then the servant ran to meet her and said, "Please, let me drink a little water from your jar." She said, "Drink, my lord." And she quickly lowered her jar to her hand and gave him a drink. Now, when she had finished giving him a drink, she said, "I will draw also for your camels until they have finished drinking." And notice the order there. She doesn't water the camels first. She waters the servant first. And then she waters the camels. So she quickly emptied her jar into the trough and ran back to the well to draw, and she drew for all his camels. Meanwhile, the man was gazing at her in silence to know whether the Lord had made his journey successful or not. When the camels had finished drinking, the man took a gold ring weighing a half shekel and 2 bracelets for her wrist weighing 10 shekels in gold and said, "Whose daughter are you? Please tell me, is there room for us to lodge in your father's house?" Okay, so he's saying, are you the type of lady who will make room in your father's house? She said to him, "I am the daughter of Betuel, the son of Milcah, whom she bore to Nahor." Again she said to him, "We have plenty of both straw and feed and room to lodge in." And that expression there, she says also, gam makom, room. And so you already know about hamakom, the place, and what it represents, the house, the temple. The place where you would find the presence of Adonai, hamakom. And so she says, yes, there is room. There is a place to lodge in. We can make room for more people. So that tells you again that she's got that heart of Abraham, that hospitality. But she also extends the hospitality even to the camels. And she mentions straw, teven. And this is going to be the first mention of straw or teven in Scripture. And so right here, we have something that's going to be our guideline. As we're trying to understand what the Hebrews are doing, running around Egypt looking for straw, what it has to do with anything other than sweating the obscure things so that we will be distracted from acts of true worship. But right here, we have an ideal that's going to show up actually later in Isaiah, where it talks about the Messianic kingdom and the conditions of the Messianic kingdom, and how not just the ox is going to eat straw, but also there will be carnivorous animals like lions who are also going to eat straw. In other words, there's going to be less fighting. So what do we see in Rivka? She has characteristics of a firstborn. She serves others. In her case, she goes down and comes up from a spring, which is a source of living water, which also gives her some messianic attributes. Remember Yeshua at the Feast of Sukkot specifically, and that's something to keep in mind until you hear tomorrow's lesson about Sukkot as it relates to the portion. Yeshua stands up and starts saying, if you will come to me and drink, I will be a source of living water. You'll never thirst again. Secondly, she gives the servant water to drink first, then the camels. Here's what to remember. The Torah is very much interested in animal husbandry. How will you treat your beast? Simply being human is not a divine right to mistreat an animal. But the camels are the transporters of the humans. They're not the humans themselves. In the same way that straw is the carrier and the supporter of the grain, it is not the grain itself. In the same way, the beasts of the field might be our transporters. They might be our supporters. In some case, they might be our entertainers, okay, or our lap dogs that calm us down. They can serve human beings in all sorts of ways, and the ways are only limited by the number of animals that are on the earth. Each one of them has a role to play to the human being, but it's a supporting role. That's why it says with Esau and Jacob, remember the prophecy was the older will serve the younger. That's the proper order of things. When we look at the sixth day of creation, the beasts were created first. They were the firstborn of that day, but they were created in order to serve the younger of the sixth day, which was the human being. That's the proper order of things. They're both to be sustained. They're both living creatures, but one is to serve the other. Rivka gets it right. Straw is important. We have to take care of the camels, but there has to be a makom. There has to be a place for the human beings. There has to be living water for the human beings. And then the camels can be refreshed. It's basically a picture of the resurrection and the creation, which is groaning, actually beginning to be restored. Third, Rivka offers provisions, and the specific thing that she names is straw. Again, our first mention of Tevin. And just after this, the servant does something significant, and it's going to carry us into tomorrow's lesson. When we get this first mention of straw, immediately the text says, the man bowed low and worshiped the Lord. That's Genesis 24:26. The man bowed low and worshiped the Lord. So Rivka mentions, I have straw for your camels, and this is how the servant knows she's the one. He bows low and worships. And so when we see, again, the Israelites suffering under a straw man argument, for Pharaoh basically, you know what, it's about laziness. You don't really want to worship the Lord. You don't really want to go and worship him. It's just a way of getting some days off. So I'll have you go chasing straw. I'll have you go chasing insignificant things. I'll have you go chasing the things that the beasts of the field eat. And so those two things are important because that's the essence of our straw man problem with this Torah portion. And the next time we see the straw, after this first mention with Rivka, and then the servant bows low and worships, that's when it's going to come up in the straw man argument with Paro, where he's saying, I don't want you to go worship Adonai. I want you to go run around the fields picking up straw. And I guess we're really out of time. I really at least wanted to tie this in for you before tomorrow so you would know where we're going with it. And what the Jewish commentators say about this is that when Paro makes this straw man argument, when he makes this decree, that it becomes a virtual prohibition against observing Shabbat. They're working on the premise that the Israelites did keep the Shabbat even before Moses came along, even before the giving of the Torah at Sinai. So let's just ride with that for a second. Let's just say that's true. If that were true, if they were working 6 days a week, like normal people did back then, but now the work is increased, where now I have to find my own straw to do my normal 6-day work, then their 1 day of rest would now have to be devoted to scavenging for straw to make the bricks the other 6 days. Which again, if we connect themes, it makes us think of the Tower of Babel, where it says the people, they took and made bricks. They baked them thoroughly to build this tower up to heaven, to connect with heaven, basically to usurp the power of heaven. And so we can see something similar in the pharaohs. In their reigns, they had to start immediately, by the way, with all these pyramids and statues and temples and things that they built. When a pharaoh basically took the throne, he immediately had to start his building projects in order to have something finished by the time he died. And these things were supposed to help him in that journey to cross over and to take his place with the other Egyptian gods. But see, these building structures, because they were outwardly so awesome, they were very deceiving, because you would go look at a pyramid. You would go look at these huge pillars and these temples. You would go look at all the artwork. And you would think, wow, he must be a demigod. He must be ruling by divine authority to have built all this. But that's basically the attitude of the brick makers at the Tower of Babel. It says, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they use brick for stone, they use tar for mortar, making monuments to their own supposed divinity, their own desire for divinity, to be their own God. And then in Exodus 1:14, it says the Egyptians made their lives bitter with hard labor in mortar and bricks, and in all kinds of labor in the field. All their labors which they rigorously imposed upon them. And so the real challenge, the straw is just the straw man. But the real challenge is, who is the creator? Who is the divine authority? Who is the God of Israel? Who is the God of covenant? Who's the only one? And we have to make that distinction. And as we work through this tomorrow, we're going to go back and focus on this Shabbat. And look at not just some good textual proofs that probably this was the end result of assigning the straw duty, is it did force them into the fields to gather straw. We're going to look at an interesting textual link with another part of the Torah, and you're going to be like, oh, wow, they probably did have to go to work on Shabbat. But he accomplishes this through accusing them of being lazy. And if we think about Jewish communities through the ages, this has been a common accusation because, number one, they keep Shabbat, they rest every seventh day, and they keep a lot of holidays, and we do too. And if you're interested in producing work and products and so forth, then these sorts of people are annoying to you. You can't just call them in on Saturday. They don't want to be on call on Saturday unless they're in a medical profession or law enforcement. They always want to be off, at this time in the spring and this time in the fall. And it's inconvenient. Another accusation that's been leveled against them is that they're greedy, they're money grubbers, because they've been money lenders for much of history, at least after the diaspora. But see, that's a straw man. It's diverting attention from the facts of the case. They became money lenders precisely because they were prohibited from holding so many other occupations. They weren't allowed to do anything else. So if you're going to call them money grubbers, then at least acknowledge they're money grubbers because the world made them by closing off every other option, and they could only do this very limited number of occupations. And so you can't fault them for becoming exactly what you created. They simply adapted to the conditions. Their occupations had to be fluid because typically the pattern is the Jewish community would go into a country, they would begin to prosper. The kings or the queens would borrow from the Jews because they would lend. And once they realized they were at a point, well, I really can't repay what I have borrowed, then they would issue some decree, some inquisition, some pogrom, some way to either eliminate Jews or to kick them out of the country. And so their resources had to be fluid, able to transfer from one country to the next at a moment's notice. Right? All because they refused to lose their identity as Jews, as Sabbath keepers, as keepers of the appointed times. And I'll leave you with this until tomorrow. If you keep the Shabbat and you keep the high Sabbaths of the feast, then I can guarantee you there will be people who come along, maybe many, maybe few, but they will come, and they will accuse you of having questionable motives for keeping the Shabbat, questionable motives for keeping his appointed times. And it's meant to confuse you. Remember how the tzira works. It confuses above, and then it cuts off the fruit. And when you become confused about why you keep Shabbat, when you become confused about why you keep the feasts, when you start majoring on the minors in confusion, it will cut off your fruit. And the corollary to that is when it feels as though the system is crushing Shabbat out of you, for a season, it may seem like Moses and Yeshua have disappeared on you. Where are they when I need them? Where are they when all my coworkers are mad at me because I put in for vacation during Sukkot? Where are Moses and Yeshua when I got passed over for a raise because I won't work on Saturday? Where are they? They called me. They awoke me to his Shabbat. They awoke me to his feast. They made me understand that from the creation, these things have been appointed for mankind. They revealed this to me and they disappeared. Why aren't they here just clearing out the vacation schedule for me? Why aren't they here just putting money in my bank account so I can go to Jerusalem for the feasts? Why aren't they just sowing favor among my family so they'll quit accusing me of being in a cult? It's okay. If it's happened, if it's happening, or if it does happen, What you have to decide is whether you and your Father are going to walk on together. Knowing you're going to walk through fire, walk through the sword, because you believe in the resurrection. You believe that you are a firstborn of Yeshua. You believe that you are firstborn of the Father. You believe that you are the firstborn Israel. And if you don't keep the Sabbath and if you don't keep the feast, then the world will continue in its confusion. And that's why you walk on together. But if you're not sure, once the hard times hit, once the pressure starts, if you're not sure, you're going to be much easier to confuse, and you'll start suspecting your own motives. Don't suspect that. You can suspect your ability to do it, but never suspect that the Spirit has called you to this walk and to walk with the Father. And don't be discouraged when you fail, when you make errors. Do not be discouraged. It doesn't mean that Shabbat is not Shabbat, and it doesn't mean that you weren't called to it. It just means we're still in Egypt. But we're going to hang on till Yeshua and Moses come back with some pretty awesome plagues. And all the confusion the world tried to impose upon you, and all the fruit they tried to cut off from you, it's going to be cut off from them. So take heart.